Hello, I'm Karen Pascal. I'm the Executive Director of the Henri Nouwen Society, and I want to welcome you to a new episode of Henri Nouwen, Now and Then. Our goal at the Henri Nouwen Society is to extend the rich spiritual legacy of Henri to audiences right around the world. Because we're new to the world of podcasts, taking time to give us a review or a thumbs up or even share this episode will mean a great deal to us and allow us to reach more people with meaningful and hopefully deeply spiritual content that continually reminds us of Henri Nouwen's writings, his encouragement, and of course his reminder that each and every one of us is God's beloved child. So with that said, let me take a moment to introduce my guest. Today on this podcast, I am joined by a very dear and longtime friend, Brian Stiller. Brian is the Global Ambassador for the World Evangelical Alliance. This global association represents some 600 million evangelical Protestants around the world. Prior to this, Brian was the president of Tyndale University and Seminary. Brian's the author of a dozen books, and together in our shared broadcast history, we created hundreds of hours of television programming together with our weekly series, Cross Currents. Brian, one of the most memorable interviews that you did for Cross Currents took place in 1995 at the L'Arche Daybreak Center with Father Henri Nouwen. What was that experience like?
Well, Karen, wonderful to be with you on your series. But of course, we didn't know that we were just a year before his death. And for us to capture these hours of interviews with him was remarkable. Of course, Henri Nouwen was a hero in my world, offering into our Protestant community the understanding of the mystical and the work of the Spirit in daily life. And so to meet him and then to have this special privilege of interviewing him over these hours was remarkable. And as you know, in this first one that we're going to get into, he talks about his background, the caring for people when the SS troops had arrived in Holland, how he developed his understanding of ministry. This is going to be a very interesting and exciting journey with Henri in this first episode.
Well, we have a treat for our audiences today because we're going to play the first in a series of 3 uncut, never before heard in full interviews with Henri Nouwen. When it comes to a broadcast and documentary program, we make choices about what we have time to share and what gets left on the cutting room floor. Today, our podcast audience is in for a treat. We're going to get it all in this first of 3 podcasts drawn from Brian Stiller's interviews with Henri Nouwen.
Henri, your childhood was shaped in Holland during the time of occupation. What did that do to the formation of your mind and heart and your understanding of God at work in life?
Well, it's interesting. I had an extremely loving, caring family. And that love and care became particularly clear in a time of enormous amount of stresses and struggles. And so I grew up during the war years. And my father and mother really did every possible thing to protect us from the violence and the ugliness of the war and to give us a very regular life. And both of my parents were deeply spiritual people with a great love for Jesus and a great desire to have their children grow that way. And even my grandmother was even more a person who nurtured my spiritual life very much. So when I was 5 years old, I wanted to become a priest already. And I actually never changed my mind. I had that desire from very young, as a very young child. And
was there encouragement by your parents to think that way, or did you just come?
Well, yeah, it was the climate. I mean, it was we lived a very. My father's a lawyer, and my mother was a very sensitive person with an enormous literary sensitivity. And they both encouraged our whole family to live a life of prayer and a life of spiritual reading and so on. And somehow the desire was there when I was very young. I was the oldest son, and in our family we had my uncle was a priest, but came very naturally. And when I was even very, very young, I was already thinking about myself as being close to Christ, but also to be a minister somewhere.
You tell the story when the SS troops were trying to take your father away, and he had built this hiding place in your home, and he was hiding there one day when the SS troops came in, and you were about to take him some food, and you didn't. As the fear element of that moment, what did that do to your understanding of God at work in your own life?
Well, I was quite young, you know, and I somewhere I felt very, very protected by God, in fact, in all of that. And where I must even say that the German occupation and the time of war, in a way, was a time in which we were encouraged very much to deepen the spiritual life. I've never felt, you know, so spiritual and so religious precisely when our family had to be very close and very protective, and we prayed a lot, and we brought people in the circle of prayer. And it was, I don't remember that time as a time in which I questioned God or wondered how God could allow all these things to happen. That wasn't part of my emotional upbringing or thinking at all, actually.
You know, Henry, as I read your material and the many, many books that you've written, it seems to me the central element of your writing and your ministry is defined by hope. And as I reflect on your time during occupation, the despair of that occupation, is that where you first learned about the hope element of the gospel?
I don't dare to don't think so. You know, it was just like, you know, it was what I learned very young, that God was real and Jesus was very, very present. I remember as a little child, but mostly when I became around 10, I could hardly believe that anyone did not believe in Jesus or anyone did not believe in God. And I think what it meant was that I sort of felt an intimacy and a closeness and a directness about my relationship with God. It was sort of as close as you're sitting here in front of me. And it was amazingly, it was an obviousness to it and a directness to it. Prayer was not a problem. I just loved to pray. I loved to be in church. I loved to hear about it. I listened to every radio program. And it wasn't that I was particularly pious compared with other people. It was just natural, normal surroundings. And it was much more that than the war that developed in me, that whole, you know, hope in God. And it was not so much hope in God that something would get better, as well as I would need to see the experience of God's presence here and now in our daily life. It was very, very real. And only later, it's interesting that when I already was ordained a priest, I had to discover that feeling or that emotion isn't always there. And even today, I have to sometimes remember these experiences of intimacy that sometimes later aren't there anymore, and then it becomes a question of faithfulness, even when my heart or my body or my mind isn't always fully there. You know what I mean?
Yes.
And
but then as I kind of walk with you through your life, you become a scholar, you become well trained through the universities of the world, but then you move towards an interest in psychology, and your life changes from being a scholar academic to being a psychologist and then a pastor, and then you go to Burrio in Peru and you live with the poor. And tell us about that pilgrimage of your life and why you made that choice out of academia, out of the great halls of Harvard, to care for mentally handicapped here in Canada.
Well, as I was saying to you, from the very early on, I wanted to be a priest. And that I wanted to speak about God to people and to bring people closer into the relationship with God. That was sort of a desire I had as a child. That's why I went to the seminary, diocesan seminary, so I could be ordained young and could work in a parish. And when I was ordained, the bishop didn't send me to the parish, but said, you know, you'd like you to go on and study. And I said, what I would like to study is not more theology, but psychology, because I want to know a little bit more about how people behave, how they think, how they feel, what's going on in people's life. But after I'd finished psychology, and I was a psychologist, and I knew about diagnosis and about therapy, I suddenly realized that I had to integrate my spiritual journey at home and in the seminary with this psychological knowledge that I had. I didn't want to become a psychologist. I always wanted to be a minister who has an understanding of psychology. So I applied for a fellowship, and I was accepted at the Menninger Clinic in Topeka, Kansas, which had a program called Religion and Psychiatry. And that was a very, very influential time for me, where I, under the influence of Carl Menninger and others, I learned to integrate my spiritual journey with my psychological knowledge and my psychological understanding and so forth. And I had excellent supervisors. But when I finished that, I just was invited to, by the University of Notre Dame, to come there and to help out a little bit in a new psychology department. And so I wrote the bishop and said, well, I can come home yet. Would it be all right if I accept that for a while? And he said, yes, do it. And so I started to teach. But my teaching from the very beginning, and I would say to the very end, was more a pastoral teaching than a scholarly teaching. I was very much interested in bringing people into a knowledge of God that was very real, very simple, very direct, and very, very much helping them in their own journey. So I never thought of myself very much as a scholar. I thought of myself, I would really say, as a pastor who used the classroom as its pulpit. You know what I mean? Even though I did a lot of research and a lot of academic work, the main interest for me was always ministerial formation. And even in the psychology department, I invited priests and ministers to come and, you know, do pastoral psychology. And when I went back to Holland for a little bit, I studied a few years of theology to reconnect with the theological tradition. And then I was invited to Yale to be there in the theology department at the Divinity School. And I was suddenly found myself surrounded with hundreds of young people, women and men from all religious denominations, from backgrounds, you know, all from Baptists and Congregationalists and Episcopalians and people from Methodist background and some Catholics, and you know, and this was a men and women from, you know, and I was absolutely fascinated when I was invited to come to this school that was enormously rich in variation and so. And I was invited to be a pastoral theologian there, but they gave me an enormous amount of freedom, and I felt what I had to teach was to integrate the integration between the spiritual life and the life of ministry. See, that's what I was interested in.
But it seems that your ministry wasn't just to use a pulpit and a psychiatrist's couch side by side.
No.
But that indeed you were exploring other people's needs through your own pain and suffering in your personal journey. So there was a deep integration of self into your ministry.
I was very, very convinced from the very beginning that ministry is to lay down your life for your friends, okay? Like Jesus said, being a shepherd is the one who lays down his life for his friends. But laying down your life, you have to have first a life to lay down, you know? You have to know who you are. And by laying down your life, I don't mean physical martyrdom. I meant your pain, your anguish, your doubts, your confusion, your this struggle with your sexuality, your struggle with relationships, you knowing and not knowing, and the whole complex you're dealing with living in a world where there are a lot of injustices. So you live all that interiorly, and how can you get in touch with what you're living? How can you really enter into that and discover there God's healing grace? And to make that experience, that adventure with God is in your own life as a kind of the source of your ministry. That's how I even got to this concept of wounded healer. That came out of my own sense of loneliness. When I came to the States, I wasn't feeling all that connected. My feeling of my need for friendship and community, and I didn't have that very much. My anxiety, whether I would do well or not so well, all these human struggles that everybody has, I started to try to articulate that, to find words around it, and then to say, well, if you're in touch with that, then you can bring other people in touch with that. And then you become like the fertile ground for God to let the word sink in. You know what I mean? It's
Yes.
like if the ground is not broken up, how can the seed sink in? And I felt more important than announcing good news was, first of all, to break the ground where the good news can bear fruit. You know what I mean?
I'm ordained as you are, and so as in a sense, church professionals, the tradition has been for us to be kind of have it all together and be the dispensers of grace and dispensers of wisdom. And so to be a wounded healer really cuts across the grain of professionalism in our culture, doesn't it?
It does. It does. I think we live in a world where professionalism suggests that somebody are strong and others are weak, or some people have it together and others not, and that those who are strong should help the weak. Now that's not, I don't think, what the gospel is speaking about. I think it belongs to the center of the gospel that God became vulnerable, that God stripped himself from power, that he didn't cling to his equality with God, but emptied himself and became a human being like we are. And that the essence of our faith is that Jesus became in everything like we are. And I think that means, basically for me personally, as a follower of Jesus, what I have to offer is first of all my own vulnerability, my own weakness, my own brokenness, my own wounds. Now, not uncared for. I mean, I have to. My wounds can only be a source of healing for others if I care for my wounds, if I bandage them well, if I pay attention to that. But basically, my gift is not my power, but my willingness to be powerless with other people who are powerless, and to create a fellowship of the weak, and trust that there God's healing power will become visible. I mean, I'm very, very convinced that what we have to offer is vulnerability, to lay down your life for your friends, to be compassionate. That means to suffer with, to feel the anguish and the pain of others in your own guts, so that you can be with people. I mean, just for a second, just look at the story of Jesus and Naim. Mm-hmm. The woman of Naim who brings her only son to the grave. Jesus sees a widow that means he lost her husband, and he has only one son who died. And it says Jesus was moved by compassion. And if you literally look to the Greek, it says he felt the suffering of that woman in his guts. There's a Greek word, like splanchnitsomai, and the word splanchna means guts. Jesus experienced the anguish, the loneliness, the pain of that woman in his own interiority. And he could be with her so close that in that closeness, he was moved so much that it was a movement to life. And therefore was able to give the son back to the mother. But the miracle is not that the son was raised to life. I mean, the son is going to die later on anyhow. But the miracle was that Jesus loved so deeply and affectionately this mother that he gave her back new life. You know, and I think that's what ministry is about, is to not worrying about raising dead people to life, but first of all to be compassionate with those who suffer losses. And trust that will give life.
Yeah.
That's something else, you see.
The first time we met Henry was at the Parliamentary Prayer Breakfast in Ottawa. I did the evening dinner, and you did the morning breakfast. And I was astounded by your approach. You were standing in front of the head table, and the Prime Minister was there, and the heads of the opposition parties and the head of the Senate and the head of the Supreme Court and the Speaker of the House, all the symbols of power. And you stood and you opened by saying, I have a word of God, from God for you today. And I thought, how audacious. But it was interesting as people just sat back, and you could almost see by their body language they were saying, and what is that word? If other people that I know who are public as religious spokespeople had said that, they would have said, who do you think you are? But there was something out of your weakness. That day you had spiritual power.
Mm-hmm.
How does that come to you? How do you appropriate the power of God in your own brokenness and weakness? So you were spiritually powerful to the powerful, and yet you were weak.
Well, the power of God becomes visible through our powerlessness. And first of all, that's what you see in Jesus. Jesus is the most powerless of all human beings. I mean, he not only became human, but he died in the most horrendous death, stripped not only from his clothes, but stripped from friends, stripped from his experience of God. God, my God, why have you abandoned me? Jesus was completely powerless. And he hung on this cross with nothing. And then this incredible word that John says, and I am standing here, and out of his side came water and blood as signs of life. New life was born at the moment of total emptying. And I think when I was claiming some authority, it was an authority that I claim not because I know something or I have a particular voice that speaks to me, but it was more that I felt very much that I who live with very weak people, very broken people, very, very non-verbal people, a community of very weakness, that in that community I had discovered and seen the power of God. And the power of God's healing, the power of God's love that comes out of brokenness, out of weakness, out of vulnerability, out of people who are very marginal, very poor, very, and quite often, quote, useless in the eyes of the world. And I discovered that precisely there, where people are poor, and where I am poor, and where we are poor, God's power is manifest, and we are empowered. But it's not a power that comes from control. It is not a power that comes from having things all in your hands. In fact, it's the powerlessness of the person who finally stretches out his hand and is girded and led to places he rather wouldn't go. And I felt very, very free to say, I'm a very powerless person. I live with powerless people. But I am deeply convinced that this is the place from where I have something to say that comes from God.
But that's so radically different from the whole cultural assumption of power and authority.
It is, but that's the gospel. It's countercultural in that sense. That's also what it means for me to live in a community where I am now. That's why I finally chose to leave the university and join a community.
Is that
so to be empowered by the poor, to be empowered, not so much, I don't have power because I have a degree in theology, I'm not powered because I read many books, or I'm not powered because I know so many things. I might know a few, but basically that's not where my power comes. My power comes from the empowerment through living with the poor. That's where it comes from. And that's what the whole center of the gospel is about. Blessed are the poor. Jesus doesn't say, blessed are those who care for the poor. Jesus doesn't say, blessed are those who help the poor. Jesus says, blessed are the poor. Blessed are those who grieve. They will be consoled. It doesn't say, blessed are the consolers. Blessed are the helpers. Blessed are those who know better. It says, blessed are those who are weak, who are broken, who are poor, who are mourning, who don't have it together. Because in their brokenness, there is a blessing hidden. And blessing means a power of God's presence. There are good words hidden. Blessing comes from benediction. Bene means good. Diction means saying things. And God is saying good things precisely in the place where people are broken and weak. And that's where the healing power of God can become manifest. And I think that's what I've seen. I've seen it all the time. It's not an idea. This is what I'm living day by day. I'm living with people who don't speak, people who don't walk, people who are very, very weak, but in fact who radiates out of them God's healing power.
But it isn't just the fact that they are poor or that they're weak, but is it because God is at work within their poverty and their brokenness? Like, is poverty and brokenness of itself God speaking, or is it the world or the environment or the means by which God speaks?
Well, God had chosen the weak to shame the strong. Paul speaks about it in Corinthians. He had chosen the little ones, those who were not wise. God kept choosing those who are on the margin of the society to speak, because those who have nothing to lose, who in a way are poor, that means have nothing to lose, are the ones who become the carrier of good news. It's very real. What is important in life? What is important in life? Important in life is things like knowing that you're loved, knowing that you belong, knowing that you're not
An outcast?
No. Knowing that you're somewhere safe. And in the world in which we live, people are saying, you better prove that you are good. Why don't you do something relevant? Okay? Why don't you do something relevant so people can say you're a successful person? Why do you do something that makes you popular? So people see you and you have a good name. Why do you have a little power so you can influence people with whatever you have? And Jesus is saying these are temptations. Jesus is saying himself, I don't need to prove to the world that I'm loved. I don't need to change stones into bread, which is to be relevant. I don't need to jump from the tower to be on television, to be popular. I don't need to kneel down and have power. I don't need any of that to prove that I am the beloved Son of God, that I am the beloved child of God.
I just am the beloved.
I am. That's there. And and I'm saying all this because the people that I'm living with are precisely the people who aren't successful, aren't popular, aren't powerful, and in a mysterious way, because they aren't able to prove anything, they can live out the truth of who they are. That in their brokenness, in their weakness, in their inability to be successful and popular and powerful, they communicate somewhere in a very direct way that they are the beloved children of God. And my task as an articulate person who can talk and can do a lot of things is in a way to bring these gifts of the poor to the front and offer them to our society as a source of healing.
Is that why the gospel calls us to conversion, to the
That's
new
right.
birth? Because it's so radical in opposition to the cultural norms, the prevailing attitudes of today.
Oh, it's enormously
That's why
radical.
conversion is essential to a person coming to Christ.
But conversion is, first of all, is an ongoing thing. It doesn't happen once. Conversion is a lifelong process. Conversion is claiming again and again and again the truth of myself. And what is the truth of myself? That I'm God's beloved child. Long before I was born, and my father and mother and my teachers and my church got involved, and I will be God's beloved child long after I've died. I go from God's intimate embrace until God's intimate embrace. God says, I've loved you with an everlasting love. I've loved you before you were born. I've knitted you together in your mother's womb. I have molded you in the depths of the world. I was there long before any human being was there. And I loved you, and I have written your name in my hand. You're safe in the palm of my hand. Long before you were born. And I'm sending you into this world for a little time, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 years. That's just a little bit. So that you have a chance to say, I love you too. See, that's what life is about. Life is simply saying yes to God saying, I love you. And you say, yes, I want to say yes to that. I want to say yes. And all the struggles and the pain and the anguish and the losses that take place in our lives are endless opportunities to claim God's love. I lose my mother and I'm in deep grief, but can I live that grief as a way to say yes to my belovedness before I was born? I lose a job. Can I somewhere live it, not to become bitter or angry or resentful or jealous, but can I somewhere claim that even though I lost my job, even though I'm not relevant, even though people praise me, even I'm not a big shot, that still I'm the beloved child of God. I can start living from that place. See, that's the spiritual life. To live from the place of your spiritual truth. And that's what Jesus heard in the Jordan. When he came out of the water, a voice came and said, you are my beloved son. On you my favor rests. And Jesus lived from that place. And people loved him. And people hated him. And people said, Hosanna. And people said, crucify. All that was happening. But Jesus says, I remain the beloved Son of God. And everybody will leave you, but my Father will never leave me alone. And it's from that place. And he calls us to believe that you and I are as beloved and as important to God as Jesus. And we shouldn't say, well, Jesus was the Son of God and we are not. I mean, Jesus says, just as the Father loved me, so he loves you. He calls you the beloved. You are becoming, I'm calling you to claim the truth of your divine child, that you are a child of God, the divine childhood.
Well, Brian, wasn't that something? What did you think of what you were listening to again?
After these years, to listen to Henri, it was like it happened yesterday. What struck me, Karen, was how he had gone from a priest to a scholar to a psychologist to a pastor. He used this notion, he said, I used the classroom as a pulpit for ministerial formation. He took the essence of his faith, his understanding of how to deal with faith in a scholarly way so it's not trite or frivolous. And then as a psychologist, he understood the emotional framing of a person and how the gospel speaks into that life. It's 360 degrees. He just has a way of enveloping me as he talks about life, about ministry, about hope. And so to listen to him again is just such a wonderful treat.
I always love being around people that are growing. And in a sense, Henri could have stopped at any point and said, this is what I am. But he was on this journey. He was on this, and it's interesting how he discovers, the whole issue of our weaknesses are what we can give to others. And from this, we can really connect with them, and we really have something to say into their lives. I mean, it is profound, isn't it? It is the journey he takes us on and he challenges us to go on, is to be so vulnerable, to be so open.
And Carrie, remember, I used the story of the Ottawa prayer breakfast when he stood before the Prime Minister and the head of the Supreme Court and others at this large prayer breakfast, and he said, I have something from God for you today. I was so shocked that he would have the temerity to say that in front of all these people, but they just settled back, and there was an anointing, there was a presence of Henri, and of course, coming out of his message that day of the wounded healer, he spoke out of his powerlessness to power about the presence and power of the Spirit. So it was a coming out of a powerless person who had a powerful message to people who were of power. It was a marvelous triage of ideas and the presence of people as he spoke that morning.
Brian, one of the things that I remember about this series of interviews was that Henri felt he was talking to a peer, a pastor, someone who really got it. He appreciated the depth of your questions, but also you were comrades in this, and it was really quite wonderful to be a part of. I know we had tried so hard to get Henri on our show, and we would have liked to have brought him to the round table. I'm so grateful he said no, and we ended up in his, really literally in his living room, talking with him, with, as people look at the images behind or some of his library, some of the books. But people are in for a treat because this is just the first of a series of 3 podcasts. So I hope you'll come back for the next one. You will not be disappointed. If you did enjoy this podcast, again, we'd be so grateful if you take time to give us a stellar review or a thumbs up or share it with your friends and family. As well, you'll find links in the show notes for our website. You'll even find a link to the documentary Journey of the Heart, The Life of Henri Nouwen. And in this film, you're going to see Brian Stiller interviewing Henri Nouwen. Thank you again for listening. Until next time.